we'll get things going here. So thank you, everyone. Good evening. Thanks for joining for today's talk. So this will be on the management of Cayuga Lake water levels with Howard Goebel. My name is Liz Kreidinger, and for those of you who I haven't met yet, I started as the executive director for the Cayuga Lake Watershed Network in March of this year. I know that many of you are familiar with our work, but for those of you who aren't, we are a 23-year-old not-for-profit organization that works to identify key threats to Cayuga Lake, its watershed, and advocate for solutions that support a healthy environment and sustainable communities. So also new to the network's team is our program associate, Molly Newman. Molly will be really involved in our communications and community outreach efforts going forward, and she'll also be helping out with tonight's chat during the presentation. So this talk is going to be a continuation of a series that we've hosted about water levels on Cayuga Lake. Last year, we had Bill Capel, emeritus hydrogeologist from the U.S. Geological Survey, present on lake levels, including some great historical context. And the Watershed Network's board chair, David Wolf, presented on climate change trends and implications for our watershed. And those recordings are all available on our YouTube channel. And I just checked recently and I saw that there are over 800 views. So it's clear to me that this is a topic that is really important to our watershed community. And we're excited to bring you this program with Howard Goebel this evening. This talk will also be recorded and up on our YouTube page soon. So feel free to check back for it and share it with folks who you think would be interested as well. So now tonight's speaker is Howard Goebel. Howard served as Chief Technical Officer of Canals for New York State Power Authority since 2019. In this capacity, Mr. Goebel is the leader of the Canal Corporation's water management program throughout the 524-mile New York State Canal system. Prior to this role, he served as the Deputy Director of the New York State Canal Corporation, in charge of the engineering, construction, and maintenance. And he also held the position of canal hydrologist, where he was responsible for all facets of their water management program, including navigation, water supply, hydropower, invasive species, and emergency management. So what we'll do is have a Q&A session after Mr. Goebel's presentation. But please feel free to drop questions in the chat and we'll collect them up and make sure that we revisit them along the way in the Q&A. And with that, I will turn it over to Mr. Goebel. There you go, Howard.
Yeah, thanks, Liz. Appreciate the invitation and opportunity to speak to the Watershed Network. Had a long relationship with this group, and glad to have you taking on the new role, Liz, and they got a good one. Also was able to watch Bill's presentation live when he did it. I think it was the third time I heard Bill do the presentation, and it's amazing what you learn every time you talk about this subject. It's not simple. It's not something that is necessarily easy to understand, but I think there's a lot that can really be understood, and I hope we cross some of those bridges today. So boy, come on. Okay, we'll start with a big view. Oswego River Basin, Cayuga Lake's part of the Oswego River Basin, a 5,200 square mile watershed that is larger than the state of Connecticut. And this includes all of the Finger Lakes and the Seneca River, generally flowing north and then west to east. The Oneida Lake flowing east to west, joining at the Three Rivers Junction with the Seneca River and Oneida River join, and then the Oswego Canal flowing north into the Oswego River Basin. I think this is a good illustrative graphic, which kind of shows the elevation difference, the high points to the north, and as we get lower, as we approach the Lake Ontario plain, and that really has a huge impact on our water management. Some of our challenges, the lakes are all operated independently. Canal Corporation has limited control. The system has fixed hydraulics, meaning that 100 years ago when they built the canal, they built this waterway, and that principally hasn't been upgraded. widened, deepened, or whatnot. And the hydraulics are really what they are. Since the canal was built, barge canal opened in 1918, there's been no shortage of floodplain encroachment. People building in flood-prone areas, whether they knew they were flood-prone at the time or not. And then development throughout the watershed. I think it plays into the previous discussion with climate change. We also have development going on within the watershed, where generally farmlands and woodlands have been greatly transformed, strip mall, subdivision, or ag has switched from generally some low runoff producing to maybe some high runoff producing aspects. And then something we've been plagued with is limited water level forecasting. And we'll just run through, I think, each of these in the presentation. Just showing it from a different perspective, the uplands with the Allegheny Plateau, when the last glacier receded, it receded to the north and pulled down the lower levels into that Lake Ontario plain. And so we get this water generally moving fast from the uplands into the lowlands. And that creates some real challenges from a water management perspective, because you can easily evacuate the lakes, every one of them, with the exception of Cayuga Lake. And Cayuga Lake's the only lake that's downstream controlled, meaning that when you release water, you're limited by how much the lower end of the control aspect, the control mechanism is. And so we'll kind of walk through those aspects. Water management facilities. Here are the entities who regulate the lakes and some of the control features downstream. I'm not going to read each one of them, but just to recognize that we do have a myriad of public entities, municipal, county, Keuka Lake with the Keuka Lake Outlet Compact, a body that has jurisdiction over taxing and water levels, as well as Seneca Lake, regulated by a hydropower company, Gravity Renewables, and for years was regulated by NYSEG. NYSEG sold it. I believe Pat Boot regulated it for a while. Then a guy from California, an outfit called Seneca Falls Power Corporation, ran this. And so with different ownerships, you get a little bit different operation than you have in the past. And then downstream, we have a variety of things. But most importantly, the Canal Corporation regulates Cuba Lake, and we regulate Oneida Lake as well. And the rest are controlled by separate entities. We regulate the dam, the next downstream dam at Lock 24 in Baldwinsville. And we have a single Tainer gate. We operate that with 2 hydropower facilities as well that are all enjoined in that. So we're just one of many operators. From a coordination standpoint, something that started before my tenure in 2001 was a lake managers report done on usually on a Monday. Canal Corporation reaches out to each of the water management entities of the Finger Lakes, and we more or less ask them, what's your current level, what's your desired level, and what is your release strategy for the upcoming week, what's your current discharge, and what's the trend of your water levels. So we circulate this and communicate this amongst all of the members of this group, and something that's done pretty well. We greatly communicate with Gravity Renewables on a daily basis to ensure that water level changes made from Seneca Lake flowing into Cayuga are understood. And that's, I think, a very cooperative manner. And generally, the other lakes, when they make substantial changes, keep us informed of the changes they're making. When we look at the Cuba Lake watershed, we have both an elevation change, and I think it's good to just keep in mind Keuka Lake's much higher than Seneca, which is much higher than Cayuga. And in reality, the restriction here of the outlet of these lakes are generally limited by the waterway itself. It's not necessarily a downstream control immediately, but the Keuka Lake outlet and the Cayuga Seneca Canal each have hydraulic limitations on what can be released. But one thing that does happen is that the fact that there are lakes, Seneca Lake and Keuka Lake upstream, do definitely diminish the timing and amount of runoff. And so they're really storage bodies that are able to store water and diminish ordinarily what the runoff would be if those lakes didn't exist. And as well, from a negative standpoint, we can get into a point when right about where we're right at a high level on Cuba Lake that we can't take any more, maybe a time when the operators of those bodies have to release more water. And so timing is always an issue, but we really work in a collaborative fashion to ensure that we're not only aware of what they're doing, but we're communicating before those changes are made so we can plan to the extent we can. Downstream control I mentioned, but I really want to describe it. That 32-mile distance between Cayuga Lake and the next downstream dam in Baldwinsville normally today has 6 inches of water difference between them. And we'll talk about this a little later, we'll see how as the flows increase out of Cayuga Lake and the Seneca River and the releases from the other Finger Lakes, I think this was a graphic grabbed from the USGS and Bill Capel's work. It shows that flat level of the canal receives all this inflows from all of the Finger Lakes, but it's hydraulically limited. And that flat reach really has an impact in Cayuga Lake's management because that creates a downstream tailwater effect. And it's not just of our doing, it's of the doing of all the managers in the basin. Here's a picture, Cayuga Lake from an aerial perspective. I think I saw his name on the list here. Bill, I forget his name, took this picture from his airplane and sent it to me. Bill Hecht, and I've still been using it for a long time, but I think it really illustrative. The lock CS1 is used for navigation only, moving boats as an elevator from Cuba Lake downstream or from the downstream Cayuga Canal up to Cuba Lake. It's not used for flow water management. The Tainer Gate Dam is the only release operative structure that's used to control the amount of flow out of Cayuga Lake necessary to maintain desired levels and release desired levels as well. The Seneca River and the Cayuga Canal join just kind of in the upstream area. I don't know if you guys can see my cursor here or not, but they join, kind of wraps around here, and they join there as one downstream. So very important. Every day I have some key gauging things to look at, and what our gate settings are and the water levels both upstream and downstream of the Tainer Gate Dam here are very useful information for us. I'm just taking a little different viewpoint for kind of a downstream view of what these Tainer gates are. They're 630-foot wide Tainer gates and used to regulate water levels. Generally in the summer, we're maintaining around 383.5 as a summer target. And the normal downstream level, and I use that term normal kind of tough, that's our, when water levels are low, and like this summer, when we went through a kind of a 6 or 7 month long drought, we were able to maintain the waters, near that 1174.5 elevation. But as flows increase, obviously, the downstream water levels increase. So rule curve. This is our kind of our target of what we're trying to do. It's a levels of the canal, which what level of Cayuga Lake, which were essentially established. The original target was actually before this target was created, I believe in 1907. There was kind of when they're constructing the canal, someone came up with a minimum navigation level for the canal. I believe it was 381.5, a maximum one, I believe 383.5. And they were just straight lines, and then adopted a target level in 1930, which is that kind of brownish red line in the middle. And that was the only target level. After consternation with the lake level generally going too high above a minimum target level, 1969, state adopted a maximum target level to say, hey, we want to no lower than this, but we also don't want it any higher than this as well. And certainly the use from a navigation perspective has changed greatly from the 104-year history of navigation in the barge canal to what it is today. But this is really what created. And then same time in 1969, geez, we used to get a lot of snow, but said, hey, we better build in a high snowpack target level. So when water levels are being managed, we can take into account the snowpack and allow us to essentially lower the water levels. The challenge with this is that we found that lowering the water level below 379.5 is rather problematic, and that our phone kind of ring off the hook with people with shore wells, including private homes and businesses who lose their water supply. when the water levels drop below 379.5, and as well as some of the municipal water supplies that take water from Cayuga Lake. Largely, one of the big issues with Cayuga Lake is wind, and we do get wave action. Certainly, when there's strong winds, we can have some pretty steep winds. You guys who live there know that, and wave action. And sometimes with the trough of the waves can create some air entrainment into the pumps and create some real problems. So we generally do our best to keep account of the snowpack levels. We do snow surveys on a biweekly basis throughout the entire Oswego River Basin, among other places in the state. But so we're certainly aware of what the snowpack is and adjust accordingly, but we do keep in mind low water levels. From a maximum target level to a minimum one is kind of tough when the minimum target level in April and for half of May is only 0.2 lower than the maximum target. And so an idealized target for minimum and maximum that are awful close, but really difficult to achieve. And I'm going to show some graphics which I think show this case. We can manage the water levels, I'll say generally pretty good, but in the spring with the before the growing season starts, before all the snow is melting and the spring runoff occurs, is the greatest challenge for us to maintain Cayuga Lake levels within these rule curves, because we truly are at the mercy of Mother Nature, and we'll just kind of walk through that. Just pull up a graphic from 2002, and a lot going on here. This is published on our the Canal Corporation website, canals.ny.gov, under water levels, Oswego River Basin. And these are updated twice weekly to keep the public informed of what's going on. And if we're having changes that are going on every day, we'll update them on a daily basis when necessary. But it just gives some information about some when flood damages begin to occur, major flood, and then a 100-year flood elevation. I think it's good to look at those to get an idea. The red line is what Cayuga Lake was on a daily basis, generally at 8 o'clock. But the most important part of this graph to me comes down to water management, is the difference between the red level, Cayuga Lake levels, and the downstream Seneca River water levels. This is what is really controlling the discharge. And generally for us to deal with elevating water levels as they rose in late February and March in 2022, we had to release more water. In doing so, we rose the water level downstream 5 feet. And it's just a consequence of our operation. And so generally we operate, you can see that 378 number in early January. That's kind of like a target level for us, that there's no damage downstream of 378. But when we get above that, 380 is a target. That when we get above 380, we start putting water into people's homes downstream and flood septic systems and wells and roads and driveways. And so we do our best, and I say our best, to try to maintain that downstream level below 380. And the two levels, the Cayuga Lake level and the downstream level, are inextricably linked in our operation, and don't just allow us that ability to release whatever water we want to do at the time. And I jump ahead to November of this year. It was a droughty year. I mean, boy, the lake was managed really well, and the downstream levels were really well, because we really didn't have runoff producing rain during the growing season this year. But had an event in mid-November after the growing season was over, well into the dormant season. And, you know, a nice rain event caused some runoff, and as we are still trying to lower the lake as a rule curve, it resulted in some increased water levels, albeit minor and within our established parameters, but still something that we have to deal with as we manage Cayuga Lake. Look at 2021, a little different, a little wetter year, and we had numerous episodic events, largely were remnants of tropical storms that made its way into New York. And while the levels were able to be maintained on Cayuga Lake generally pretty good, other than in late August, we had some elevated water levels downstream. And as I mentioned before, during the growing season, our ability to do this is far greater than it is during the dormant season, where in late October, we had a massive rain event, and then rain and rain and rain. And you can see how, while we had water levels above the flood damage level on Cayuga Lake, we certainly were well out of the banks in the downstream level by several feet. And this is the issue. We weren't able to release any more water downstream, and you have to have that kind of that shared consequence. if we look at late October, I'd say probably around the 25th, I'd say the difference in the lake level in the downstream Seneca River was less than a foot. And so you start to kind of lose control on your ability to, today it's 9 feet, and it was less than a foot or about a foot then. And so you see what your control is. We could have let more water out, but the two water levels would have became one and we'd have lost all control. 1993 was the flood of record in the Oswego River Basin. So when I was doing my graduate work at SUNY ESF on snow hydrology. And certainly remember the news articles running day after day, all of this flooding. And you can see here in early April that the Cuba Lake water levels and the downstream levels were one and the same. And the water levels were so high downstream. So the releases from Canandaigua, Owasco, other parts of the watershed, which are not Skinny Atlas, that are not part of Finger Lakes, were putting in all sorts of water into the system. And actually the Seneca River reversed flow and water was flowing into Cuba Lake. And I wasn't around obviously at the time, but looking at the records, they opened all the 6 gates fully to allow the water to flow backwards because they didn't want to damage the tainer gates and allow the flow reversal to cause damage to the tainer gates. So you can see the consequence when things were out of control for about a week. Obviously there was some control gained, even though that the downstream level was above the minor flood damage level of the lake, normally 9 feet difference. So I think it's just good to see that normally I think we have a pretty good ability to regulate water levels. But during that spring freshet period is the greatest deal of uncertainty. And we had the lake down really well in February and in March. The storm was on March 13th, remember it well. 43 inches of snow fell kind of basin wide. And a couple weeks later, it was very warm and raining, and the snow melted and had a great deal of runoff. And obviously a flood of record is the consequence. Talk about hydraulic backwater. This is downstream of Cuba Lock, Seneca Lock 1. And I just wanted to point out, I got 3 lines, 1 at 1,000 CFS. The green lines are the Baldwinsville level, where the next dam is downstream. The red dots are at Cross Lake, about a third of the way along the ways, about 2/3 of the way is Port Byron in kind of that fuchsia. And then blue is the water levels immediate downstream of the Tainer Gate Dam. And at flows around 1,000 CFS near where we are now, you have about that 6-inch difference in water levels. And it's just because the river has enough capacity to convey that flow without a great deal of backwater. Kind of move up to 6,000 CFS. You know, it's a decent heavy discharge for the Seneca River down at Baldwinsville. And we'll see generally about a foot rise in the water levels in Baldwinsville. And I've heard guys from Baldwinsville say, geez, why is everyone complaining? The waters aren't flooding here. But up at Cross Lake, they may be, a 1.5 foot higher. And up at Port Byron, be several feet higher, and then going even to, 5 feet up at the downstream level. When we get into major flows, high flows, very rare, you can see by the low number of dots here, but when they do occur, we still have some really high levels, 3 feet elevated levels in Baldwinsville, with all the water levels fully open, all the gates fully open, and no more ability to raise any more water levels. But we can be another 3 feet higher at Cross Lake, another 4.5 feet at Port Byron, and upwards of 4.5 feet higher at the downstream level of Cuba Lake. So definitely the flows do have a contribution into how much water can actually be released and the consequences for the shoreline areas downstream of Cuba Lake. I'm just going to walk through a water levels going back to 1991, and these are daily levels plotted, and just kind of give you a depiction of kind of how the water levels work here. And generally we have, it seems every year, some episodic events. 93 obviously the flood of record, but we had a decent flood in 94, a decent one in 96. Incidentally, those led to the Canal, the Thruway Authority hiring a qualified water resources manager, which was myself in 2001. But it was some 3 out of 4 years had some really high rain events. And in 96, not only was in the spring, but there was a fall high water event as well. And folks had some questions and challenges on how the canal was operating. But for the most part, the high water levels are limited to that spring freshet period with an odd high water level event occurring in the fall at the beginning of the dormant season. Once we get into winter, water levels are very easily controlled. I mean, right now, I believe this morning it was around single digits, and the runoff really reduces throughout the winter. And we're kind of in that, it can snow all at once. We'll deal with it when the snow melts, but climate change has definitely changed operation of the lake, because we used to get snow that would occur throughout the whole winter. And now we're seeing these warm-up periods occurring. I think 2 years ago, we had a big flood, high water event throughout the state in, not in Cuba Lake necessarily, but in 2020. And, we last year had some good warm-ups, but we had some real cold weather as well. So it's really dependent on the oddity of rain and snow melt, and with the snow accumulation and the various temperatures that occur throughout the winter. And that has definitely changed from what it was historically. Moving into the 2000 through 2009, here was, I'll say, a pretty, I'll say, tepid period of lake levels, where the water levels were, generally drawn down to that targeted low water level of 380, other than 2007. Obviously had some reason for doing that and trying to forestall the rise in 2007, but really didn't have a lot of oddities in water level management through this 10-year period. Moving forward to the next 10-year period from 2010 to 2019, other than 2011, which I believe was associated with a pretty good spring snowmelt event, had some high water levels in 2011, but other than that, it was, I think, more of the same, a few oddball high water levels that were short in duration, but for the most part, water levels were generally maintained within desired levels. And then lastly, it shows up a little better here, 2021 and 22, some of those issues in 2021, where we had that high water levels in the late October and early November before we could gain control. 2022 is almost textbook, and from a water management perspective, makes things really easy. But as I said earlier, we're at the mercy of Mother Nature. And when that's the case, when we don't have a lot of rain, Cayuga Lake, as well as the whole Oswego River Basin for that matter, is very drought tolerant. We're able to maintain water levels at or near our targeted levels. And that's really for most of the Finger Lakes have that with those large basins and pretty good sized watersheds contributed to them. The fact that Cayuga Lake has Cayuga and Seneca upstream makes it even better for them during drought periods. And so a benefit, but obviously there are some oddities of high water that occur. And a lot of that's really based on uncontrolled runoff and the downstream control in releasing water. Here is a kind of a 20-year plot of the water levels at Cross Lake. And I only include this just to show how widely varied they are. Generally, the minimum published elevation for navigation at Cross Lake is 374.0, the spillway level of the Baldwinsville Dam. But our maximum navigation range is 377.5. So generally, you say the canal was fully navigable, except during those periods when from time to time, water levels exceeded a minor flood stage, which was generally 4 feet above a normal level, and then the moderate flood stage, which was 5 feet above normal. And so there's been some occurrences, 4 occurrences during this 20-year period. And you can kind of see here, when you kind of recall what we talked about with Cayuga Lake, what the real controls are. So we're trying to forestall water level rises and the negative impacts that occur with the lake, and certainly cognizant of the wind impacts. We have gauges at the north end of the lake. We have USGS gauge at the south end of the lake. We certainly made the USGS happy over the years. When I first started, I think we had maybe 3 USGS gauges in the whole Oswego River Basin, and now I think we have over 20. We also have our own real-time water system, and we do have a public website for all of our gauges as well. But it used to be when I made gate changes, really people weren't aware of what was going on. Now everyone's aware of the gate changes you made because they are on people very familiar with the gauges that we have. And those gauges really help tell the story of what's happening and when we increase flows and decrease flows. I talked about earlier, one of the challenges was weather forecasting and water level forecasting. And here's a current snapshot of the National Weather Service Advanced Hydrologic Prediction Service forecast. I highlighted the ones that really impact the Finger Lakes portion of the basin, and very useful nonetheless, but their ability to provide really reliable, accurate forecast is still in that development stage. And we're glad to have them. Do coordinate with the Binghamton office along with the Northeast River Forecast Center out of Taunton, Mass, to ensure that when water levels are provided by these forecasts, that at least they're depictive of reality. And it's tough when things do go haywire. We do have a challenge with rainfall is not uniform in this basin. We have greatly varying water level. Not only is it not uniform, temporal, it can be sunny in one, we've seen it many times, sunny along the canal and pouring down in Ithaca. And that's just the nature of the variation of rainfall and precipitation. So something we're taking into account with something we look at each and every day, these forecast points. But there is a bigger program, and okay, here's kind of the forecast, both for Seneca Lake down at Ithaca and Cayuga Lake down at Ithaca and Seneca Lake at Geneva. And it kind of just shows the hindcast in blue. And I do show the website here from the Binghamton National Weather Service of where, and really not much going on right now, but it does show these action levels. And I just do depict that these water levels here are in a different datum than the Canal Corporation uses. These are, I believe, in the NAVD 88 datum, and the Canal Corporation and our rule curves are all based on a barge canal datum, but we're certainly aware of what the differences are. And these at least give an idea if we start reaching an action level or a minor flood stage or a moderate major flood stage, at least we're aware. And they still have that 1993 record here. So I think it helps us for Cayuga Lake. There's a bigger picture, though, involved with the Weather Service forecast, and this is all out of the gauging that occurs. All those blue diamonds and the green diamonds as well are other locations where water levels are being gauged, and largely in cooperation with the USGS. Some of the Canal Corporation gauges, some are some gauges of others, but definitely useful information. And we just put in a new this gauge here is on Seneca River at Port Byron. So it's the first part of the Advanced Hydrologic Prediction Service that shows water levels, but they're all in nowcast, meaning what's happening right now and what's happened in the past, not forecast. So as we work and the Weather Service is able to continue developing models and reliable forecast, these data sources will be transformed into forecast once there's reliable information from the forecasting. We don't want to say that water levels are going to go down when they're really going to go up. So there is a lot of things in flux, a lot of work happening behind the scenes, but all of these data are available at this website, and the USGS gauges that support them are certainly all available in real time, near real time. I'm going to switch topics right now to close up my presentation on the Upstate Flood Mitigation Task Force. Was formed last year around, I guess, around July 1st, and was signed into law, and essentially set up the members. Director Stratton of the Canal Corporation is the task force chair, along with the commissioners. Members are from DOT, Dishes, Homeland Security, and DEC. And then the five folks here who are shown on the right are the appointed members by the governor's office, the Senate, and the Assembly. And really wanted to cover a variety of interdisciplinary focuses here to ensure that we were addressing the real needs of the flooding in the upstate area. Now, the watersheds in scope aren't the entire state. They were really set up to be the Canal Corporation bases where we had river inflow and Canal Corporation control. So we're essentially have the Mohawk River Basin, and then it's adjoining Oswego River Basin, including the Finger Lakes, are the two areas that we're focusing on for the Upstate Flood Mitigation Task Force. Areas outside of them, a lot of other ones are under different programs of the Susquehanna River Basin Commission, the Delaware River Basin Commission and stuff. And so we're going to be uniquely focused on these two watersheds. I think it's good because we have to prepare a report by July 1st of next year. A lot of work to be done. And legislation specifically directed us to evaluate the cost impact of flooding in the past 5 years and by the various sectors, including ag and human development and transportation and a whole host of things. And also to assess the Canal Corporation's operations, their procedures, and what they do and how that may impact flood mitigation and management. We're also going to be looking what adaptive measures can be developed or recommended to help mitigate flood damages and look at what is in place for developing flood control structures and increasing public communication. When the system was developed, it was not developed as a flood mitigation system. It was developed to be a navigation system for the barge canal. Largely, we're focused, especially in the Finger Lakes area, on recreational navigation now versus barges, and that use is certainly different. And the task force will be holding public hearings to solicit relevant public information as we move forward with the process. The Canal Corporation website has the recording of the meeting. We had a meeting in August, kickoff meeting. Our last one was on October 27th. The next meeting hasn't been scheduled yet, but we'll certainly make sure that we keep the Watershed Network aware of when the next meeting is going to be scheduled. Our October 27th meeting did allow us to tour the Oswego River Basin, and our final stop was Cuba Lake and Lock CS1, and I think it really helped the members get a good idea of what was going on in the system. Task force does have limitations though, and the Canal Corporation only controls certain aspects, minimal, Cuba Lake and Oneida Lake seasonally, and there are other municipal water management authorities that have their own operational controls. And most importantly, in closing, the task force is going to make recommendations, but we can't direct other government entities to act in what they must do. So we're going at this in a collaborative fashion to see what can really be done to minimize the flood frequency, duration, and magnitude within both the Oswego River Basin and the Mohawk River Basin. And that concludes my presentation.
Great, thank you so much, Howard. That's a ton of awesome information. I know there have been some questions coming in the chat, and then also we can go ahead and folks can unmute themselves if they'd like to ask a question. I'm just gonna get an eye on the group here, gallery mode. Great, so you can also use the hand raising function in Zoom if you'd like to get queued up to ask Howard a question. But I can start it off with one that has come in through the chat, which is, let's see. We have a question from Bill Pecht. If there are any plans for relief channels to Lake Ontario, and if so, why or why not?
Relief channels were studied by the Corps of Engineers in 1941 and deemed to be both ineffective and extremely costly. And when they did the work, we didn't have issues to deal with like we do now with things like historic preservation and environmental concerns and Indian tribal nations and stuff. So the cost to do this now is really challenging. Something we're going to be studying as part of, I'm leading in the task force, I'm leading the hydrology and the subcommittee chair for the Hydrology and Engineering Subcommittee, and we will be looking at what the Corps proposed in 41 and built to see if there's a way for us to update those numbers and see what the really costs were. And we also need to ensure that the cost of implementing any solution is going to be less than the benefits that are derived from the implementation of any flood mitigation strategy. We assume that these would largely be FEMA funded type projects, and they all require a benefit cost ratio to be achieved, that the benefits derived are more than the cost of the project, or else they're not able to be funded. A good question.
Great. Wonderful. Let's see. Actually, I think, Howard, if you go ahead and stop your screen share, then we'll be able to pull everyone's. Look at all those faces. Okay, great. I see Maureen Doyle. Do you want to jump in and ask a question?
I sure do. Thank you. Maureen Doyle, I'm over on the Cross Lake Seneca River section. Howard, although the water levels have been great, and some say we've been in a drought or we were in a drought, the groundwater table appears to be high. Do you have any input on that?
Well, I would agree with you with everything you said. We were in a drought, no doubt. I call it a moderate drought, but droughts are not only from a magnitude standpoint, they also fall into a duration standpoint, and it lasted quite a while. But with the onset of the dormant season, with the leaves changing and the switch in hydrologic season from the growing season to the dormant season, we're obviously in the season of maximum groundwater recharge. So now rainfall really results in runoff. And I think we're seeing now in these last few weeks, before we've had really water levels get cold enough to freeze and have snow on the ground, that we certainly do have a change. So we do monitor groundwater levels that the USGS does throughout the state to give us an idea. I sit on the Drought Management Task Force, and we're still meeting because the droughts do still persist. And the questions I've been asking all along, that if these conditions do persist throughout the winter, what does that really mean for a spring runoff period? But I don't think that's a concern in the Finger Lakes area. Largely, we have huge storage reservoirs, and we seem like we always get enough snow and rainfall, whether it's in snow or in rain, to obviously fill these reservoirs and lakes. But the uncertainty is how wet the watershed is. We're still at the mercy of Mother Nature. I think as we start getting down into a cold period, though, that water table and things are going to change a little because of the ground freezing and having a frost developing.
Thank you.
Great. I have a question here from Sheldon Rabin. Sheldon, if you want to jump on and ask the question yourself, feel free to. Otherwise, I'll go ahead and do it for you. All right, so he is asking, oh, there he is, great.
Oh, hi. I was asking whether there's any connection between the changing water levels on Cayuga Lake and the serious vegetation problem we have in the northern part of the lake.
Well, certainly drawing the levels down more in the winter has an impact on the vegetation, but largely the vegetation issue has really been borne out by the onset of the of mussels, zebra mussels, and water quality levels across the state canal system have improved greatly. I grew up along the canal, and I remember it being back when it was a barge canal, and seeing flotsam and oil slicks, and never ever thought of fishing on the canal. And now with transformation to recreational use and with the onset of the zebra mussels and quagga mussels, water clarity has improved greatly, and so has the onset of a variety of weeds. And now we have a great problem, especially in shoreline areas and shallow areas, with invasive species like water chestnut, among others. I know down in Ithaca was there. We're going to see Roxy was on the phone or on the call when we found hydrilla in the Cayuga Inlet in Ithaca, and they're plaguing issues that are not easy to resolve, and you can't back down. You got to stay with it and stick with it almost perpetually, or it could consume it. These are very virulent plants, and certainly water management does have its role, but we're not really able to lower the water levels down to a point where we could have a really hard freeze and really contain and control these water levels. But to the extent that there are variations going on, there are some benefits in that shallow shoreline areas.
Great. All right, I don't see hands up, so I'm going to keep going on my questions we collected here. So let's see, another question from Bill Hecht. Are there any plans to dredge the canal downstream of Cayuga Lake?
Well, there is ongoing dredging that we do both upstream, a great need for dredging for navigation upstream and downstream. And we have a large upland disposal site just downstream of the lock and the dam that we're certainly use actively. And it's a really responsibility for the Canal Corporation to do so. We have completed a bathymetric survey of the whole entire New York State canal system, which has led us to show us where we have dredging needs and where we don't. And generally in the main line of the navigation channel where the Canal Corporation has jurisdiction, in that section of the canal downstream, we really have pretty good water level depths, ones that aren't retarding flows, but there are a lot of backwater areas that are filled in not only with sediment, but with water chestnuts and debris in many of the backwater areas around Hayti Island, Howland Island, and other areas that certainly are problematic. We are working with DEC on trying to do some wetland enhancement programs and open up those backwater areas and kind of change the downstream condition to be more accepting of floodwaters. But those aren't short-term solutions. They're going to take a while to implement. But our whole hydrology engineering subcommittee is going to address that question, as well as the divergent channels you mentioned as well, to see what opportunities do we have to really look at improving and minimizing the flood nature of the system.
Great. I saw John Berger has a question.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yeah, we can.
Maybe I time my thing was probably a little glary here. But anyway, thanks. It's a really fascinating presentation, and I feel like there's other issues, but it seems like we're just discussing, hydraulics and stuff. But there's some things going on that I feel like I would like to mention as an example. I was up a couple years ago. I think it's Green Point. It's along the east side of Lake Ontario. It was one of those years when it was really high. Well, these folks had mobile homes and it was great. They were right on the lake, but it wasn't great because they were in a really, really low-lying area. There were sandbags like right up to people's, and some of them were underwater. It was really sad to see. So these folks were living, they had lakefront property, but only because it was really flood prone. So it seems like there's an issue, like, I'm not sure from what you're talking about, like what kind of damage are we talking about in some places, like around people's houses that are lake houses, probably poor people. They have cottages that are not as well elevated. I didn't really understand what you're talking about in terms of what damage is done when water levels go down. Is it because people can't pump the water from the lake? So there's many, many issues. But the other one I would just like to say is I also mentioned in a question that I sent in about the Sodas Ditch, which was in 1804 or something like this. It was a proposed canal from the Erie Canal through up into Sodas Bay, and it was only like 6 miles of canal was going to connect up to Sodas Creek. And it never happened, but there was a huge amount of land speculation, even in Ithaca, because that would have made Ithaca like an inland port. It's really fascinating. But that never came to pass, and it was kind of forgotten, I guess, because of the railroad. But anyway, I noticed looking on the maps that Cold Springs is an area down by Baldwinsville. And it looks to me that probably there was a lot of wetlands down there, and probably a lot of it's been filled in. I don't know if Howard, you know much about that, but what is the connection between Cold Springs and possible wetlands, and also like Oneida Lake and Onondaga Lake and the confluence of Oneida River flowing into the Oswego River? Because there's 8 locks on the Oswego River, starting in Phoenix, going up to Lake Ontario. And the Sodas Ditch, so-called the Sodas Ditch, would only have required 2 locks, right up near Lake Ontario. So I'm not sure that's ever been considered in terms of like how to evacuate water. One way is to speed it up, which now is not the preferred method. If it can spread out, that's better, but it doesn't want to spread out onto people's lawns. So I'm sorry to go on and on about this, but it's a very complex issue, and a lot of it's cultural and even political. And I'm not sure how much of that you want to address, but I'll stop talking now and let you respond.
Yeah, I mean, you asked a lot of questions there, and so John, really good. And I certainly took notes here and understand what your questions are. A dynamic, complex system, no doubt. During low flow periods, during dry periods, during average conditions, that competition for water and things really isn't too challenging. But during elevated positions, when the flood of record occurred on Cuba Lake in 1993, there was a flood of record on Cross Lake, and there was also a flood of record on Oneida Lake as well. And so it wasn't that Cuba Lake existed in some grand isolation, but part of a whole system. And that there have been obviously studies, as Bill mentioned, with the divergent channels. And I think, yeah, the 1804, certainly before the barge canal, the Erie Canal, the 1825 and the original Erie Canal was built, there was discussion about doing a lot of different things. And we're trying to run the system we have right now to the best that we can. And certainly challenging. And I think that, there's a whole host of issues here that come into play that we're looking to see what can be done to mitigate these. They're not simple solutions. They're not easy. What may be good for Cuba Lake may not be good for downstream areas, just may not be the case. We're trying to run this system as a whole, as a system, not just one lake at a time, but trying to minimize the net impacts, and making those big changes that you mentioned are certainly big undertakings. And we're going to hopefully in my subcommittee here try to address some of these big issues and see what can and can't be done. One thing that we have developed and we really want to use is a model of the entire Oswego River Basin. So we can look at these what ifs. What if in 1993, we know what the rainfall, we know what the runoff was. What if we managed things differently and we had divergent channels and we had different other flood control mechanisms? What would be the result? And then what would be the cost? And look at what that offset would be. So I'm not sure we'll be able to cover that whole topic in the Upstate Flood Mitigation Task Force, but I do believe we'll be discussing it. I'm certain we will. We'll see what sort of recommendations we come up with for further study, because it's something that really isn't going to end on July 1st of 2023, but it's going to go on for a long time. And we want to see really what can be done to minimize this ongoing plague problem of seasonal high water and episodic flooding that occurs in this basin.
Great, thank you. Okay, I have one here from the chat. This is from Charles Brady. Charles, if you want to unmute, you can go ahead and ask that. Good, it looks like you're unmuted.
My question, you talk about the flood of record in 1993. Hurricane Agnes in 72 seemed like it was a lot higher than whatever we saw any time since then. And I can't go way back. I've been on the lake only 70 years, but Agnes was the highest I ever saw it.
Yeah, and Charles, I don't, I just read the gauges I have. I certainly wasn't paying attention to things in 1972. I do recognize Hurricane Agnes, very well aware of it. Certainly, if I studied it to death, and well aware of the issues, and certainly it is certainly nothing shy of what happened in 1993. But the data I have do show, from the water levels the Canal Corporation show water levels a little lower in 1972 than I did see in 1993. But I'm not looking for a real argument with that. But it was another event that wasn't snow related. It was certainly a hurricane, the first one of the season, on June 1st of 72. And it does show that the area and the whole region is suspect to not only winter flooding, spring freshet flooding, but summer flooding as well. And those can occur at any times. With climate change, we have a lot more water in the atmosphere than we've ever had before. And the likelihood of having tropical storms hitting New York State is continuing to increase, and something that we need to be aware of. And not a lot that can be done about it. When we see a hurricane spinning down in the Gulf of Mexico, I'm always looking, oh geez, what should we do? And if I can go really increase the release, I can only lower Cayuga Lake about 1/10 of a foot a day. Maybe 2/10 of a foot a day would be a real lot. So it's not like we can really provide a great deal of storage when we only have a week's notice that the storm may even hit New York, let alone hit Cayuga Lake. And then if we lowered it a foot and the storm totally missed, just say it stayed to the east of Interstate 81, then geez, how can we lower the water levels in the Finger Lakes when the storm never hit us? And so there's a great deal of hedging that goes on to ensure that we can manage water levels based on the accuracy and reliability of the forecast. So good point.
Great. Okay, we'll go to David Wolf.
Hi, great presentation, a lot of information really fast there. I'm really glad to hear that, how the Canal Corporation has really adapted itself, as it is adapting itself to recognition of climate change, and how this is, it's so dynamic, and using some of the latest technology coming into the National Weather Service and all of that. But I wonder how locked in do you still feel from sort of a historical notion among the stakeholders of a calendar schedule. So like the boaters want to get out there, and the fishermen want to get out there on certain dates in April, and they expect the lake levels to be going up. Whereas homeowners along the lake, the lake levels are low, and we can hear about a major, tropical storm rain system coming in, and yet we see the lake levels going up because it's, I guess, April such and such date. How are you dealing with some of those things? How do you deal with the different stakeholder interests, and moving away from a calendar-based kind of approach to monitoring lake levels?
Well, I think regardless of what the rule curve says, we're still looking at what is happening hydrologically in the basin. And obviously, if we have no snow, and I'll tell you, the greatest complaints I ever got with Cayuga Lake, and I can't tell you the year, I believe it may have been 2007, but I'm not sure, was when a year I couldn't get the lake to go up. And oh my gosh, it was beautiful, 70, 80 degrees out, and the water was so low, the launches weren't usable. People had beautiful day, beautiful weather, and I can't get out to fish. And that year I had my garden planted on April 12th. Usually I can't plant my garden until Memorial, frost and things like that. But that year was an unusually warm year from this climate change. I think really good demonstration of that. So we're hedging all the time, and we were waiting for those April rains to come, and they didn't. Gosh, it just rained, and it didn't. And boy, it kind of put a note in my head. This is never going to happen again, David. We're going to make sure we hedge in both directions, not only on low water levels, but on high water levels. And what's the consequence of that is we may have higher water levels for periods following those drier periods if we did get an onset of heavy rain before the growing season starts. And so it's that kind of that shared impact and hedging. And if you understand my hedging, meaning too low water levels and too high water levels, and trying to walk that fine line. A year like 2022 was like, could have done this job sleeping, but that's not indicative of what we have most of the time, where we're hit by forecasts that never really come to fruition. And I've seen rain forecast of 3/10 and gotten 3 inches. I've seen 3 inches forecast and have it not rain. And that's awful tough when you're looking at the consequences of having too low water levels with the same issue of having too high water levels. So we're balancing that all the time, and we're making a lot of calculus and a lot of assessments to seeing what is the most prudent fashion and form to take in our water management. Very challenging at times.
Thank you.
Okay, great. I think so. It is 7:30. We're going to be wrapping it up here. I just wanted to thank everyone for their asking questions and participating. I know we have a few questions we didn't get to. Howard, what would you say is the best way for folks to continue to follow up with you and getting more information and questions answered if they didn't get something in tonight.
Yeah, I'm an email fanatic. So, my email was up there, howard.goebel@nipa.gov. It's pretty straightforward. Certainly Liz has that. And certainly, Liz, any of the questions that weren't answered, please send them along. I will get answers back to you and we get those distributed, or we can do whatever we want. Or if
Okay.
anybody has any specific question, I'm certainly reachable, and really enjoyed the relationship. I see some folks on here that I haven't talked to in 15 or more years, but good to see them. And, been around for a while, and but relationships really help. And so if there's issues that are germane that people have, we certainly want to have a discussion about them rather than having them in some silo.
Great. Yeah, we're looking forward to continuing these discussions with you. And then last question, if folks are interested in keeping up with what the the flooding task force is up to and when the meetings are, is there something that can be subscribed to so that they get alert when the next meeting is scheduled, or should they just keep track on the website?
Well, again, we are, I think in our first two meetings, we're in that growing phase. I expect for the next meetings will be well publicized, and we'll certainly include the Watershed Network on the forecast, on those schedule, and try to get the forecast out as soon as the meeting's scheduled, so everyone has enough time to adjust their schedules. And I know we're looking at holding a town hall style meeting. We're going to actually have people actually come, and whether it's virtually or in person, to come we have some recommendations and give their opinion of what our recommendations are. This doesn't work organically if we come and tell people what we think. We really want to have it input from all the stakeholders throughout each of the basins to provide their insight and their recommendations. I think some of the questions here are very on par with some of the issues we have, and those certainly will not go unattended to.
Great. Okay. Well, you heard it from Howard himself. Everyone should go ahead and subscribe to the Watershed Network's free listserv if you haven't already. We have a link to that on our website, and we'll keep you updated on that event when the date is published, also on our social media accounts. So thank you so much, Howard. That was a great presentation. I know a lot of people really care about this subject. We will put it up on our YouTube channel. Folks have been asking when they can find that. So that will be up there just in a day or so you can check it out on YouTube. Also, just a reminder, folks, the Cayuga Lake Watershed Network is a membership-based organization. So if you value this sort of program and would like to hear more from speakers like Howard throughout the year, please consider joining as a member. You will keep up to date on Cayuga Lake issues through the network news, printed mailing that we do throughout the year, and online. So thank you so much for those of you who have renewed your support for 2023 already. It's incredibly motivating, and I'm really enjoying getting to meet everyone and to know you all and your concerns and excitement for protecting our lake. So with that, have a great evening, and we'll be in touch.